We're going to continue our discussion about China. This is an extremely important development that we must stay on top of. The State Department announced today that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is going to postpone next week's scheduled trip to Beijing. Of course, that was intended to try to soften the tensions between the two superpowers and would have actually marked the first high-profile visit by a senior U.S. diplomat since 2018, which, of course, was before COVID originated in Wuhan. But the question is, what kind of conclusions can we draw from all of this? Joining me now to react to this and more is Chang. He's the author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can, in fact, follow him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang, and we encourage you to do so. But Gordon, thank you so much for joining us on Washington Watch. Always good to have you back.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. So let's jump into this. Before we actually get into the diplomatic and policy implications of a Chinese aircraft above the United States and Secretary Blinken postponing his trip, I'd like to know your initial reaction when you first heard the news of this situation.
Well, certainly the balloon incident indicates that the Chinese did not want to talk to Secretary Blinken, didn't want to talk to the U.S., because this is an obvious provocation. Sending a balloon over a U.S. Air Force base, which houses intercontinental ballistic missiles, and loitering there is a real affront to the U.S. And they had to know that Blinken would have had to have canceled his trip, or at least postponed it. And what's even worse is that NORAD, the U.S. Air Force, is actually tracking a second balloon that is headed our way, pretty much on the same track that the first one is. And that's a real indication that the Chinese want to provoke a conflict, because otherwise the question is, why would they do something like that at this particular time?
Okay, what you bring up is an extremely important point, and I want to go a little bit further in both of them. Number one, you said they seemingly are intending to be provocative in what they're doing here. The question obviously is why, and why would they want to cancel next week's trip with Secretary Blinken?
That's a great question, and I don't have the answer to that, though I can probably speculate that Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, who's got full accountability, has a number of crises on his hands that he cannot solve. So, for instance, he has continuing debt defaults, plunging property prices, contracting economy, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, and, of course, the COVID-19 outbreaks. And maybe he wants to distract the Chinese people from policy mistakes which he can't solve. That's one possible explanation. I'm sure there's other things that are going on. The Chinese political system, Congressman, has gotten more and more opaque over the last couple of years. So we know less and less what's going on in Beijing.
Well, then let's bring it back here a little bit. There's been, in some regards, very, very little communication coming from the Biden administration and the Pentagon. But then there have been some remarks, I think, largely unsatisfactory. But overall, what do you make of the response at this point from the administration and the Pentagon?
I think that it is clearly inappropriate. Here we have a Chinese surveillance craft now hovering over the United States, heading eastward. And there really is no response except to watch it. This should have been shot down well before it reached the United States, because the track of this balloon took it over Canadian territory, uninhabited Canadian territory, for hundreds and hundreds of miles. There was plenty of opportunities to intercept it, but they didn't do it. And, one indication is maybe the Chinese wanted to humiliate the United States in the eyes of the world, saying that the Biden administration could not defend American airspace. And, that's not an unreasonable interpretation right now, because we seem to be paralyzed.
Yeah, it really is. And, the fearful thought that we're talking a balloon. This is not like a major Air Force type invasion of our airspace. It's a relatively slow moving balloon, and we've let it come. And like you said, I was looking at the path of this thing earlier today, and yeah, there were multiple opportunities to deal with it. That said, Secretary Blinken has canceled his trip to Beijing, and I would like to get your reaction. Here's what the State Department spokesman Ned Price had to say yesterday about that planned trip.
That's always what we do when we engage the PRC. We speak and act in ways that protect and promote our interests and those of the broader international community, as we seek to see to it that the competition that really is at the heart of our relationship isn't in a position to spiral into conflict.
Wow. All right. Your reaction to that?
I first of all thought, even before the balloon incident, Secretary Blinken should not have gone to plan to go to China, because there was nothing that he could really accomplish there, given the nature of the discussions that we have seen from China. So what this balloon incident did was to break that off, and it's probably going to break it off for quite some time, especially if there are multiple balloon craft. This is a real indication that China just, for one reason or another, is not ready to deal with the international community on a good faith basis. And we have to understand that China is preparing for war. And it's unfortunate, but we need to prepare as well, because the Chinese, for various reasons, can take us by surprise right now. We don't have a sense of urgency. We're not understanding the way the Chinese think. And this is just a recipe for a historic disaster.
Well, that's what concerns me, Gordon. I've got to tell you, the realization that we seem to be so lackadaisical in this and allowing this thing just to continue its path. We've got about 30 seconds or so left. Where do we go from here? What should State Department, Defense Department, what should be the actions at this point?
Well, if I were president of the United States, I would order Secretary Blinken to go to Taipei instead. And I would then start to cut relations with China. We need to impose costs on China for clearly belligerent behavior. We haven't done that. And because of that, the Chinese continue with belligerent conduct that could really lead to global war.
Gordon Chang, always great having you on Washington Watch. We appreciate your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Congressman.